Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a non-traditional legal program with your host and trusted advisor, Liz Myska, your guide through the web of life's dilemmas.
Welcome to another edition of Connecting the Dots. I'm your host, Liz Myska. And today I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming my friend, Eliana, formerly, a graduate of Clark University, now at Penn State. Welcome, Eliana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Liz, for having me here. It's nice to be here.
You and I met under interesting circumstances. You want to tell the story?
To say the least. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd love to tell the story. So I did my undergraduate at Clark University, and when I was a sophomore at Clark University, I got an email saying that there is a person who is looking for volunteers for learning a self-defense technique for visually impaired people. And I thought, well, that's new. Never done that before. And I was, at a time where I was, middle of college. I was trying to do new things, learn new things, meet new people. And so I reached out to the person that sent the email, and Liz was behind that email. And I said, I'm interested, and we should meet. And so, yeah, I think the meeting was a more adventurous one than I thought it would be. But, me not knowing Liz and not knowing what I should expect, I'd never really interacted much with a visually impaired person before. And so we were trying to find a place to meet. And Liz said, why don't you come downtown? And me being an international student, having no idea what really the town looked like beyond the campus and not having had a car, I was nervous. And I said, I don't know about that. And Liz said, well, how do you think I feel?
Exactly.
I can't see.
Turn the tables. I don't drive and I can't see.
Yeah. So we kind of settled on Liz coming to campus to meet me. After sort of multiple attempts to figure it out, we ended up meeting on campus, and the rest is history.
The rest is history.
Yeah.
The rest is history. And now that's what? You graduated 5 years ago from Clark?
I graduated in 2016, so
5 years ago.
It's been
5 years ago.
5 years ago, yeah.
And you are now at Penn State, State College, Pennsylvania.
Correct.
Studying
social psychology. I am a doctoral student in my fourth year, hopefully receiving my PhD by the end of the next academic year.
And you mentioned social psychology, but I know you have a specialty.
Yes. So well, there's the broader psychology field, and usually most people when they hear that you study psychology, they immediately have the stereotype of a clinical psychologist, someone, giving therapy to someone. But I am not doing that. You have to have special clinical training to do that. I am doing social psychology, which is a field that intersects psychology and sociology. It sort of studies the dynamics of group interaction and the effect that different groups and identities have on the individual and the individual's behavior and thoughts and beliefs. And I, in particular, I'm interested in empathy and moral judgment. So I am studying empathy as a motivated social process, the ways that people decide whether to share in someone's experience or not, and also the ways they make judgments about other people's moral behavior, whether something is right or wrong. So I study sort of like the social psychological aspects of that process.
Wow, you're educating me. I didn't realize about the sociology component. That's very, very interesting. I'm just going to backtrack for a second because the reason I had reached out to Clark, well, there were two reasons. When I was trying to get the self-defense started, one, I knew that Clark was a quote unquote a psychology school, and two, my father was a graduate of Clark. So I figured, well, there have to be students who are studying psychology, studying human behavior, interested in a culture that that I was newly acquainted with, meaning the culture of the blind. So that's how why I identified Clark. What I remembered about you, the first time that we talked, you're a Fulbright scholar. You are from Cyprus. I didn't know where Cyprus was. I do now.
Most people don't.
I do now. But I thought it was incredibly admirable and brave of you to leave your native land and pursue what I perceive to be a dream. And during the time frame that you were here in Worcester, or since you've been in Pennsylvania, just and so you told me the other day that you came to Worcester in 2012. But I didn't meet you until I think 2014, 2015. But your growth, your growth as a human being, but your growth as a scholar, it's very, very impressive. So
thank you.
So
hearing it from someone else is like, wow, who's that?
Well, I know when and you and I've talked about this, when you're studying for something, you just think you're just immersed in it, and it's interminable. And you think, I can't wait for this to be over so I can start the real thing. But the real thing is the studying. I mean, it's all part of the process, and I'm anticipating that you are going to be a lifelong learner. So it's never going to be, well, now I've acquired the information, now I get to stop. So I wanted to just kind of like fill in the gap about Clark, and but I know that at Penn State you have been involved in TED Talks, and describe to my audience what a TED Talk is and what your role for TED Talks are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. So TED is a pretty, by this point, widespread initiative with the phrase "ideas worth spreading," and this is essentially the essence of a TED Talk, is that it gives you sort of a window into one idea or a concept or a story that you haven't heard before, or if you did, you haven't thought about it in that specific way. And the TED initiative has been running now for many years, and different places around the world, and frequently very many universities and campuses around the world have sort of adopted that paradigm, and the TEDx is sort of like this sort of like daughter initiative of the TED program, and any location that sort of trademarks TED gets like an X after the TED to indicate that this is an affiliated TED conference. And so Penn State, I think, has been doing this for 10 years now. And we have the TEDx Penn State conference that happens every year. And I joined part of the team, the content team, which works with speakers to develop their talk, which to me is the most interesting aspect of a TEDx conference. You basically get to work with the speaker directly on their talk. You learn about what it is that they want to talk about, and what the idea, the central concept that they want to communicate to the world. And most importantly, why is that important? Why should people care? And why should people care as much as you care about this? Because that is really one of the main aspects of a TED Talk, is that you get to have other people care as much as you do about the thing that you're talking about in those 10, 15 minutes that you're on stage. And so this is my third year working with speakers. I've worked with artists, with former FBI agents. I've worked with Penn State professors. I've worked with students, with a variety of different speakers and a variety of different ideas. And yeah, I think the central premise of doing this is that you want to inspire people to do better, because these TED Talks are often associated with ideas of social justice, of engineering our social spaces to become more accessible to everybody. to get us thinking about something that we normally wouldn't be thinking when we go about our daily lives. And so usually there is a call to action at the end of every TED Talk. And some TED Talks are different than others, like some are more science-based or hard science. So this year I'm working with a speaker who's going to talk about some fancy technology materials, which I don't know much about, but I think that for me that's exciting. That's part of the challenge, is that take someone that has no idea about these things and share your story and your knowledge, your academic repertoire in a way that's going to make that person care about what you're talking about. That's going to sort of open a window into something that they had no idea about before, and suddenly now they do.
So it's the lifelong learning again that's occurring, contemporaneously, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you at liberty to tell us what your favorite TED Talk was?
Do you mean at Penn State or in general?
Well, both, I guess.
Okay.
In general, I'm curious.
Yeah.
Was it one at Penn State, or was it in general? What was your favorite TED Talk?
My favorite TED Talk of all time. I mean, there are many great ones, but the one that really got me interested in TED and watching TEDx talks and becoming more active is a TED Talk by a neurocognitive scientist. Her name is Jill. I am definitely going to butcher her name.
Okay.
So it's Jill Boyle or something. But her TED Talk is called My Stroke of Insight. And basically, she's talking about her experience having a stroke and describing how she observed her own brain having a stroke.
Wow.
Having been a scientist sort of studying the topic of how the brain functions and what happens when the brain malfunctions, she woke up one morning and she realized that half of her brain was basically like malfunctioning. Like she knew exactly which hemisphere it was, because she knew that, I cannot interpret the numbers on the phone. Because she tried calling someone to get help and she realized she couldn't understand what the numbers meant on the phone. Or she tried to speak and she realized that like certain things that she was trying to say just couldn't be pronounced. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so she was a neurocognitive scientist who studied this her entire life, for the first time ever having her own experience going through the same things that she was studying. And it was just fascinating to watch that TED Talk. It was just like the way she described the experience, the way she immersed the audience in the experience, the way she sort of bridged her academic self and her personal self into this one narrative. She just ended up with sort of this idea that when she had the stroke and she realized that basically she described herself as sort of like melting into the environment. And she talked about how that gave her this sense of we're not as disconnected from everything else than we think we are, and how like her brain through that incident made her realize that. So it was a really beautiful talk. I definitely encourage everybody to watch it, but it was the one that really made me really interested in hearing more talks about more psychology things, but then I obviously expanding more into other disciplines and topics. So
how did you find that? Did somebody tell you about it? Was it assigned in a class, or were you just surfing and found it?
That's a good question.
Because you probably don't remember.
I don't remember. It's possible that I've heard about it in class, or maybe a professor showed part of something and then I looked it up later on my own. I can't exactly place how I first heard about it.
Okay, but it appealed to you. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it sounds like that because I suspected that TED Talks were crafted, but I never knew how crafted they were. And maybe that's a good throw over to you, that you mentioned that the speaker has an idea, but at the beginning of the process, the idea needs to be honed and the presentation needs to be whittled and polished. So talk about your experience at Penn State doing TED Talks and how you you assist a speaker, and maybe again what your favorite TED Talk was amongst the ones that you've helped prepare.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so when someone submits an application or is invited to give a TED Talk, they have something that they're really passionate about, right? They have something that they are experts on, or they've read a lot about, or they've done a lot of research on, and so they have a lot to say about. And the challenge is, how do you fit that much knowledge into 10, 15 minutes worth of time? And so,
make it palatable
exactly
to people.
Yeah, especially people that don't have that kind of knowledge.
Right.
And so a lot of what we do on the content team is trying to, let the speaker at first expand as much as they would like. Take a piece of paper, write down everything you want about this idea, everything you think is interesting, everything that you want other people to know. And then we just sort of like let them, get it out of their system in a way. Here's everything I'm passionate about this. And then we just start the process of narrowing it down and putting it into a shape. What are the pieces of this that we can extract that make it into this attractive narrative for people, that make it into a story that has sort of like a beginning, a middle, and an end? What are some personal anecdotes that we can sort of take from this story that either the speaker has personally lived through, or other people might, that sort of relate, that can make them relate to the experience? So in a way, we're making that material marketable. That's a more simple way to think about it. We're trying to
right.
to think, if we were to sell this, if this was a product, what is the best way to polish it? What is the best way to make it attractive to
and
people?
appealing? Yeah. Right.
So someone would want to sit down and listen to you for
right.
10, 15 minutes. And so we make sure that all the ideas are on the table first, and then we explain to the speaker, okay, be prepared. We're gonna chop down your baby a little bit.
I'm sure that must be difficult.
Yeah, and so there is a lot of work that goes into it, for sure. There is a lot of work that we do on the content team, because there's always that it's hard letting go of some things, especially things that you've written and they're personal to you, and so it's a long, hard process of trying to make sure that we still keep the talk true to itself and to the speaker, so that it's still something that the speaker wants to talk about, and something that still resembles the very first thing they had in mind when they were invited to talk. So,
yeah. I've only seen a handful of TED Talks, but it always seems that somebody's up on a stage and talking. So they don't have notes. They have to memorize what they are going to say. And again, how do you prepare people for that? Because I would think that would be unnerving for people. Like, oh no, I'm going to forget. Oh, I'm going to stumble midstream. And if they are up on the stage, are there people? Like, is there an audience?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, there is an audience. I mean, obviously, COVID, the last couple of years changed things. So, for example, we haven't had this year's conference yet. It usually happens in February. But last year, it was an all virtual event. But the talks were recorded as normal in person on the stage with the TEDx logo behind and everything. It's just that there was no audience. Okay. So it was just the speaker and the crew filming. And then that video was uploaded. And then the conference took place one day with all of the talks pre-recorded. But typically it happens live, and there is an audience. And I think each university sort of organizes the conference in a way that they deem, appropriate or acceptable. I think they have to abide by some TED rules that are part of the greater initiative. So I think technically they cannot charge a ticket. So it's supposed to always be a free event. That's part of, that's part of what's at the core of the TED initiative, is that these ideas are free and accessible to everybody, and they're, like, everybody that wants to get in touch with these ideas can. And so, there's a space on campus at Penn State. It's a Schwab Auditorium, and people can register and get their ticket. They don't have to pay for it, but they do have to sort of give their name in advance, because there is a capacity, obviously, to the room. And then, you get students, you get professors, you get families and friends of the speakers, you get people that are just generally interested. So there is supposed to be an audience, and this year it's supposed to be like an in-person conference with all the COVID protocols followed, obviously. And then I think you also had another question before.
Well, when it's in person,
yeah.
What if you mess up?
Right, that you asked about whether people have to memorize it. Yeah.
Right.
So we do a lot of practice. We have a lot of practice with the speakers. By that point where they get to their first practice, they've seen their talk so many times and they've edited it so many times with us that it's actually not really a concern whether they remember it, because it's just been worked with so much that they know, oh, now I'm going to say this, now I'm going to say that. And so we've had some speakers where they were more nervous about they were going to remember everything word for word.
Right,
but typically, because we make it a point to always really only convey things that lead to a certain point. So, we cut down the unnecessary details. So don't think of it as a normal speech that someone, gets up on a podium and gives. It's something where, like, if you miss that point in your narrative, then that second point wouldn't make sense. So it's kind of hard to forget part of it, if that makes sense.
They're like linked together.
Yeah, like imagine describing like an incident that happened to you the other day when you're walking down the street, right? You're not really necessarily going to memorize part of what you're going to say, because part of your story isn't going to make sense if you forget that, oh, and then someone opened the door and said this, right? So that's kind of what we strive for. We strive to make it a narrative that it doesn't feel like someone needs to really memorize these like dry parts. And what happens if they forget? So most of the time, actually, we don't really allow speakers to have notes on stage, but we found that they don't typically need them, because by that point, they're just, their story becomes just like
second nature.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm thinking where you are concentrating on empathy, you would be very empathetic if somebody froze on the stage and it was like deer in headlights, like I don't know what to say. I don't remember where I am. Yeah. I just want to have the stage floor open up and me sink down into it. So while you've been at Penn State, what was your favorite? Who was your favorite person to work with, and was it because of the idea that they were imparting?
That's a great question. I've had some great speakers, and it's hard to pick.
Remember, they're in Pennsylvania; they'll never see this. Well, unless you export this, which I encourage you to do.
Okay, all right. Well, I can talk about a couple of my speakers, if that's okay, because it's hard to pick. But I have worked with Jim Fitzgerald, who was a former FBI agent, and he was part of the team that cracked the Ted Kaczynski case. A lot of people might be familiar with it through the Netflix show Unabomber, and he's a Penn State alum, and that's why part of the reason why he was invited to give his talk. And his talk basically talked about his interest in linguistics and how that over the years has led him to develop, his identity as, a linguist and someone who studies language as a way to understand. And that was ultimately, what led to, the big case and the uncovering of the big case, and that's what made him famous. and it was really interesting just to hear about his experiences even as a little kid, mailing a letter to his local newspaper asking what's the longest word in the English language. He started his talk talking about these little moments that eventually sort of build up to this big moment of this big revelation of the case being cracked. So that was one of my speakers that I had on my first year. That was really cool. And then going to a very different kind of speaker, Syria Chatters, who I had, who actually you also met, I got you in touch, who is a Penn State professor who, works in advocating about inclusive education. And Syria is visually impaired, and her TED Talk focused on accessibility and what she called radical accessibility, which was this idea that I saw in her talk. And again, in the beginning, another example of how that happened is she came to us with like a lot of information about her life, about her story, her journey. And radical accessibility was this tiny, tiny piece of her talk in the beginning. And I saw that and I was like, that is the diamond in this talk. That's where you need to capitalize on. And so her talk, built up on her own experiences to talk about we need to make places accessible to everybody, to people with disabilities. We can't let go of video conferencing just because COVID is going to end if it ends. This is what, this is part of what makes things accessible to people. And we need to strive for radical accessibility. So yeah. So that was another great talk that I worked with. Yeah.
That one. Again, I had the privilege of being quote in the video room, in the virtual room with Dr. Chatters when the conference at Penn State was given. So I had the insider view from your perspective. But I also heard the talk, and now I know much more about the process, thanks to you. Alas, our time is short, and, but this has been a real treat to have you. Again, our journeys, my journey with you started back then, 5 years ago. So it's a real pleasure and treat to have you be a guest on this show. And again, to see how you are leapfrogging in your life and in your career. And we want to, because we here in Worcester embrace our people, we want you to come back multiple times and adopt us as your own. So thank you very much, my friend.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
And join me for another edition of Connecting the Dots.
Please note that the information provided in this show is not a substitute for consulting with an experienced local attorney and receiving counsel based on the facts and circumstances of a particular transaction. To contact Lizbeth, email her at Lizbeth@elizabethlmyska.com or call her office at 508-753-7681. We're online at connectingthedots.lawyer. Executive producers, Lizbeth Myska and Jack Peacock. Producers, John Medberry and Bill Hamilton. A production of Elizabeth L. Myska, JD, LLM, in association with Compliments.